Okay, so today what we're going to do the talk is called the religious Christian. So someone follows on from the first week we did of should you keep the Sabbath day? You know, should you keep that? And then last week or a couple of weeks ago it was um should we meet with Christians in sin? But now we're going to do, I suppose, a different sort of Christian, and that's the Christian in sin. The religious Christian. So, if you could go to Matthew chapter 6 for me, please. We'll go through verse 1 to 18. We'll also look at Matthew 23. We'll carry on into Matthew 7, um, and then we'll have a look at James. Okay, so Matthew chapter 1, Matthew chapter 6, verse 1. Um, Take heed that you um, do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues, and in the streets, so they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Surely I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room. When you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. And when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Therefore, do not be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before um, the things you have, need of before you ask Him. In this manner, therefore, pray: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. If you do not forgive men their trespasses, um, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites, with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place. Your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. So we're looking here, obviously, this idea. When I talk about a religious Christian, maybe a Christian that wants to maybe show off a little bit more the things that they do in public. Here it breaks it down into charity, prayer, and fasting. So culturally, I think charity was something more done in those days than maybe it is today. Although Christians still do get massively involved in charity, but prayer and fasting are things it's sort of assumed that as Christians we're sort of doing effectively, and obviously these can be avenues in which religious Christians or sort of boastful Christians can um, effectively show off and show themselves to be better than other Christians if they do it more, or if they make a performance out of it, and that turns into a sort of a judgment as such, or other people judging other Christians on how they should behave. Okay, so when we work our way through this, so obviously verse 1 of chapter 6. So take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them, otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So um, obviously in those days, as and today, I suppose, charity is seen as a noble deed. It's something that is good to do. But then behind this, obviously, it sort of hacks at the intention of that. What is the reason people are doing that? Um, you know, the idea, are you doing it to be seen in public by other people so that it looks good on you, or what is the true reason you're doing this? So then we get into verse 2. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound the trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Surely I say to you, they have their reward. So obviously, those who do good deeds, they've effectively had their reward. It's kind of interesting how you can do the same thing in each circumstance, but the person who does it in secret with not the intention, or even with the intention of trying not to be seen with it, is almost seen as more. It's almost seen as more worthwhile. Um, and something you'll see throughout the sections and more of the sections we'll read is the term hypocrite. It's obviously how more religious people um, are sort of talked about openly by Jesus, and you'll sort of see this a little bit more. Um, and it also gets into this idea that these things can be used by people to gain status or credibility, and we'll see more about this throughout the section. So, obviously, verse 3, but when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So obviously, the idea is obviously do it in the sense that no one knows what you're doing, which seems like the complete opposite to maybe what our natural inclination is to do, which is to show off as much as possible. We'll see more about the religious Christian when it comes to prayer and fasting. I think we'll see. But either way, God sees what you do, it says in verse 4. And as I said before, it seems like there is more worth to doing something in secret almost than doing something in public, because it's like we all know that if you can do something in public, you do get that praise and that sort of off other Christians and things like that. But the idea is to do it without boasting. So um, we see more of this idea is in why people might do it and talking about boasting when we look at Matthew 23. So if you can turn to Matthew 23, verse 13. So Matthew 23, verse 13. So this is Jesus condemning the Pharisees, the scribes and Pharisees, when it comes to the way they behave in public, and what they're doing. So, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! So as we saw from Matthew 6, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretence make long prayers. Uh, Therefore, you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel land and sea um, to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by a temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blinds, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, which is greater, the gift, or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore he who swears on the altar swears by it, and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it, and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God, and by him who sits on it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. blind guides who strain out gnats and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. So, working our way through this. So, in verse 13, um, the idea is that obviously, um, the scribes and Pharisees were often the ones that tried to tell us exactly how to be righteous, what actions were righteous, what actions weren't righteous. You can see this in Romans 10, verse 3. So Paul says, it was the scribes and the Pharisees that would tell people, obviously, what was righteous and what wasn't. But they had no idea, effectively. They're ignoring the things that make someone righteous, that make someone, that save someone. So, we can, when we think of this, think about maybe Christians today that maybe these things can apply to. So, as we go through, so verse 14, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense to make long prayers, therefore you receive greater condemnation. Something I see, I think, with a lot of Christians that maybe want to make themselves out to be religious is the difference in how they pray, the difference in how they behave with other Christians, as opposed to how they act normally. There's lots of pretense, there's lots of drama with it, and you've got to think of the other reason people often do this is to gain credibility and favour with other Christians in front of them in public. That's often what happens, and the same thing is pointed out here, and the same thing is pointed out in Matthew 6. So nothing's really changed in that sense. Christians haven't moved on necessarily from these Pharisees and scribes sort of behaviour. They act in a similar way, and it's condemned there. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, who travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself. So that's effectively talking about the scribes and Pharisees converting someone to Judaism, or they're just condemning them under their own law and making them twice as likely to go to hell as they are, because they're not really making that person more righteous by getting them along to follow the law, if you understand what I mean. They're sort of getting them on board, but it's not really helping the person at all. Then we get into some interesting ones, which kind of seem you might not necessarily know the meaning of initially. So, woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he's obliged to perform it. So all this effectively is talking about is, in those days, if you swore by the temple, that wasn't deemed as good enough, that your word isn't good enough then. But if you were to swear by the gold of the temple, then that is your word. That is like an oath. And the whole point of this and the next lot of verses are to say, well, they come in and bring arbitrary rules. They make a load of rules up that have no meaning on anything. We're told not to swear by anything. Obviously, Jesus says that later. But here they're saying, oh, well, if you swear you're going to do something by the temple, that's no good. But if you swear to do something by the gold of the temple, then that's good. You can do that. But that's just an arbitrary rule that they've pulled from nowhere. It doesn't make any sense. So the idea is that these people, like a lot of religious Christians today, will make up arbitrary rules for what seems to be no reason. Seems a religious reason. 2 studies ago, you have to keep the Sabbath day holy. Things like this. Well, the Bible says, well, the opposite in a sense. There is no meaning to these days as such as there was in the Old Testament. There is no need to keep the law. There is no need for this. If you want to, that's fine. But if you do on another day or do anything else on another, that's fine. So these are arbitrary rules made up by the Pharisees and scribes, which is similar to that of the religious Christian. So obviously this carries on when you look at verse 17, 18, similar thing. Whoever swears by this, and not by that, then that's doesn't make a difference. So then obviously we come to verse 23 in this section. So woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, neglected the weighty matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. So the idea is obviously they're keeping to these arbitrary, very little simple rules and laws, but they're obviously neglecting the more important issues. Justice, mercy, faith, which is part of the salvation process. Same goes for religious Christians. How often will they point out the tiny little things that Christians do or don't do. Now, I'm not talking about large sins that we need to accept. Remember, last week I did about when we looked at church discipline. Well, it's not legalistic to not meet with someone who's maybe in an adulterous relationship, who's unrepentant. That's not legalistic. But there are other legalistic things that Christians get involved in and think themselves as superior to being while ignoring these important things. How many people will, refrain from, I don't know, certain things on Sundays, or refrain from certain behaviours and things like that when there's no need, when the important things are mercy, justice, grace, faith, etc. You know, along with these things, how many Christians also as well tie to that hold to their works? Something incredibly important, is something of incredible worth. Well, no, really, those aren't the important issues as such. And then in verse 25, so obviously, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they're full of extortion, self-indulgence. So obviously, on the outside, things look fantastic when they're doing massively long prayers, they're fasting, and they make themselves look worse than they are. But on the inside, it is full of self-indulgence. It is full of maybe a religiousness. And what do we mean by religiousness? Well, it's doing things to get saved. It's doing things to further your way to heaven, effectively. Like a lot of religions, but that doesn't really work in Christianity, and that's not what we're about. So, popping back then to Matthew chapter 6. We okay so far? Okay. So Matthew chapter 6. So then we'll look at prayer. So prayer really starts from verse 5. We had a little bit about prayer in that last section in Matthew 23 we looked at. So then we move on to prayer in Matthew 6. So Matthew chapter 6 verse 5. When you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites. They love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. So, even an act that we should be doing as Christians, people can still turn that into a boastful event. And the idea is that we're not supposed to. Again, what was the reason that you're doing this? I've seen lots of Christian prayers where it is overly dramatic and it goes on for a long time and all this sort of thing. And if you pray like that, then fine. But then it's more about the intention, obviously, behind it. And ultimately, only you know what the intention is behind the way that you pray and why, effectively. Yeah. And I think, obviously, prayer and fasting are ways that Christians do try and gain status with other Christians. That's one of the main ways. So obviously, when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut the door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. So obviously, the whole point is it is between you and God. It's not for the performance of other people. And as it says, in verse 8, God knows already what you need before you even ask for it. So, looking at verse 7, when you pray, do not use vain repetitions. The heathen do. They think that they will be heard for their many words. So, again, another thing, don't. I guess it comes across as very religious when you do use these sorts of repetitions. Obviously, heathens would have been to an extreme extent, but even with Christians, you hear them say things that it seems somewhat unnatural in how they're going to say it. If you understand what I mean, they'll throw certain words in there. Maybe even start with the Old English and things like that, and it's just sort of different to how they would talk normally, and that's very you can sense the idea of why you do it or why they're doing it. You understand it is to gain credibility with other Christians in that particular instance. It's good. Remembering that prayer isn't a formula that you've got to mix up, that sort of thing. the more spectacular the prayer, the more spectacular the result. It doesn't really work like that. So then we get into you see from verse 9 to sort of 14. You see a template of how to pray, the Lord's Prayer. Any variants on that, absolutely fine. It's also not too long and pretty much covers everything. So you don't need to go into long, exhortations or whatever of what you want to, say and things like that. That's fine. That's simple enough. Yeah, that'll do absolutely fine. Yeah. And then when we get into verse 16, so moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance. They disfigure their faces, they may appear to men to be fasting. Surely I say to you that they have their reward. So again, similar thing when you fast, the idea is don't make it out. I guess don't even necessarily tell people all the time, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Because obviously when you do that, when you start to boast about your Christian works, again, it's for the credibility of others. And Jesus is quite clear here, they have their rewards actively. And this is still things that I believe the religious Christian will still do. Yeah. So we'll carry on. We'll skip over the next part of Matthew 6 since it doesn't quite apply. But however, Matthew 7 also goes into another sort of section or another thing that will be part of the actions of the religious Christian. So it talks about the work side, sort of the boasting, and then it gets with the other side, so the other side of the coin is the judgmental part. Because I think with boasting will come judgment of other people and other Christians. This is part of what the religious Christian will do. So in chapter 7, verse 1, this reads, so hopefully the next page. Judge not, that you will not be judged, for with what judgments you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrites! First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So we see that word hypocrite again. So these are quite obviously similar in the sense that they're both hypocritical behaviour, the boasting on the one hand, but then the judging on the other hand. And it's often through people's Christians or other, religious Christians' works that they then feel that they can judge people for not doing enough, for the wrong actions. There's a clear distinction to be made, though, like I say, from last week, because obviously some judgment is okay on Christians. This doesn't contrast or contradict the study I did last week on church discipline. In 1 Corinthians 5:3, if you remember last week, Paul expressed how he has already judged those who are sinning in the church. But that is slightly different. So we've got to assume, or we've got to sort of guess, well, not really guess, we've got to base these particular actions from what we see about Paul judging actual sin in the church. So we can kind of assume that when it says about judging people like here, it's not so much judging their sin, their unrepentant sin as such. If there are things happening in a church, adulteries or anything like that, or any other sins, then we must judge them and exercise church discipline. This, I believe, is more referring to the idea of things we're doing in our walk with Christ. How it's those sort of, as was mentioned before, like the praying and the fasting, other things, not necessarily giving to charity, but this could apply now to the amount people go to church, things like that, how involved they are in church, how maybe how pure they sort of act, things like that. Because that can be a source for quite a lot of judgment, I think, in churches. Things like that. Maybe what we might think of as sort of dead works. Now, dead works aren't wrong in itself, but there is an extent where it doesn't make you a better Christian or anything like that, or more saved or anything like that. Very nice. So this then moves us on to James. So if you could turn to James chapter 4 for me. James chapter 4, verse 11. Okay, so do not speak evil of one another, brethren. Who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and the judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who are you to judge another? Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? Is it even a vapor, appears for a little time and then vanishes away? Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. So when we look at here, we sort of go over a few things here. So obviously opens immediately. Do not judge, your brother, or do not speak evil of them. So don't slander or defame someone. Your form. This is obviously a form of like passing judgment on them, especially when you talk about it to other people. And when you judge, you're putting yourself like above like God's law, effectively. Because at the end of the day, as we've seen previously, with the specks, speck and the plank in your own eye, we're all fallen in sin. So you're not above the law there. However, again, as I said before, there is righteous judgment, and confrontation in church, which is right, and that's a righteous judgment. But um, this would assume you're talking about, um, Christian works, effectively, less so than, less so than unapologetic sin that Christians have, since that is a righteous judgment. Um, and obviously it sort of goes through here, but when we come to verse 14, it's quite interesting. So, whereas you um, do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It's even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Quite a humbling verse in some instances. If you think sort of goes, it talks about the insignificance of our life, such like as vapor, like vapor, which really puts things in perspective when you think of, maybe religious Christians will judge others in the sense that, well, our lives are such, they're like vapor, like air, effectively. They go like that, and most likely are not filled with a great deal of significance, being honest, in that sense. To what we think of, probably from a human point of view, you know. Um, so then obviously it carries on in verse 15. So this is on the idea of sort of boasting about tomorrow. So instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live, do this and do that. So importantly here, see, if the Lord wills, the credit of the things you do in your life is given to God. This section is about the idea of sort of boasting and things like that. So, um, you know, maybe a religious Christian will often take the responsibility and will take the credit away from God, often in the things that they do, the works that they perform, you know, any sort of Christian work or gift or anything like that, taking it away from God. At the end of the day, we are like vapor, as it sort of says, and we should be, rather than saying all the things we're all going to go and do, well, if it's God's will that will happen, it will happen. You know, which really brings into the question how many Christians do, submit to the word of God, how many pass it off, the things that they do as their own righteousness, or even the reverse, how many will put on someone, you failed in this because of your unrighteousness, equally the other way. So I think that is a common trait in the religious Christian. When you talk about things in ministry, when we look at 1 Corinthians 3:7, it's neither he who plants nor he who waters, but it's God who gives the increase. So it's neither of us or anything else. It's God who makes things work in that sense, especially when it comes to ministry or uh, things of works for God. To take the credit, even says in the next verse, but now you boast and you're arrogant, and all such boasting is evil. I think it's quite strong to say boasting is evil. It doesn't even just say like, it's not on or anything like that. To use the word like evil is quite a big deal. And how many Christians do you know that will boast about the things they do, the ministries that they work on, and not give the appropriate credit to God? They'll make it their own righteousness. I've worked for this. I've done, um, this is my efforts that have caused this to happen. Well, that's not true. It's God that gives the increase, and such boasting is evil. So, like I say, I've gone over sort of traits of the religious Christian. The big one, just as a recap, was obviously well, we had judging recently. Obviously, the boasting, and we went over at the start. It's the doing Christian acts um, for credit of other people, the reason that they're doing things. So I imagine we see a lot of this in our churches. We see a lot of, I think, judgmental behaviour. We see a lot of dead works. I think it's a real problem. Really stops a lot of these churches. Is the spirit there? Probably not. So I think it's a real warning. What we see, you know. So yeah. Any questions?
What do you think the reward is for fasting in private? What do you think it means?
Um,
Or praying, I suppose. Rewarded openly for it.
I don't know. I doubt it's material things.
Well, yeah, it's just interesting.
Probably a closer relationship with God, something like that. So maybe depends. Strengthening of your walk. I doubt it'd be material. You know.
Does it mean you're proud of your answer?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
It's just interesting. I'd never actually thought about that until today. What does that mean? Being rewarded
Mm.
public for what you do in private.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Everything you do for the Lord is rewarded.
Exactly.
Mm.
Apart from when you do it in public, as the scripture says.
Mm. Oh yeah, if they've already had their reward and you have it later, it is probably regarding to heaven.
For fasting in heaven?
Yeah.
Yeah, eventually. Yeah.
Looks like it. Because you focus it on the Lord. You withhold yourself from food.
Maybe it's what comes from that as well later.
Maybe.
In life.
Maybe. On a side note, I was just thinking of other things. I was thinking things, how many Christians judge things on like, the way people dress, things like that.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It's a big one with the way people dress, things people do on a Sunday, these sorts of things, just massively pertain to this.